Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here this evening. My Ontario Historical Society, and we manage this beautiful property here. Saved it from demolition back in the 90s. It's a beautiful place. We're very lucky to work here. And I want to thank all of you for joining us here this evening for this talk and this book launch of Behind the Bricks, The Life and Times of the Mohawk Institute, Canada's longest running residential school. So without further ado, I want to introduce one of the editors of the book, Dr. Alison Norman, who is our book review editor of Ontario History, a former board member of the Ontario Historical Society, and former summer student employee of the Ontario Historical Society as well. Go on up, Alison.
Okay, hi everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I know there's a few more that will be trickling in, so that's great. I'm just going to start by introducing the three of us who will speak tonight, and then I'll invite Rick to come up and really get us going. So my name is Alison Norman. I was a summer student, I think in 1998, but I'm not sure. And that was my entry into the heritage world in Ontario. I currently work for the federal government as a historian and have been working on this project with Rick now for many years. Rick Hill, I feel like needs no introduction, but he does need an introduction. Rick is Tuscarora Beaver Clan community historian from the Six Nations of Grand River. And he has worked for many years, off and on, I think at the Woodland Cultural Centre. And I think he'll talk about some of the early days there, as well as the more recent exhibits he's been involved in. So he'll talk about his work. I'll talk a bit about the book as well and about my research. And then I have one of the other authors of one of the other chapters in the book, Diana Castillo, who's at the back, and she'll come up also and talk about her chapter in the book. Diana is a lawyer. She did her law degree at Osgoode, which is, I think, when we met, when she was doing research into some legal issues that occurred related to the school. And now she's a lawyer for the Children's Aid Society, right? I think, yeah. So that's our plan for today, and I'll turn it over to Rick to really get us started.
Well, good evening to everybody. I was hired to work at the Woodland Cultural Centre in Brantford, Ontario, in 1973. And I was kind of a recovering hippie, so I didn't drive. And they still had beds in this old building. I had no idea about what the building was for. So I stayed in those beds a couple of nights and worked there for a while. And slowly I began to learn a little bit more about the building I was in and the place that I was working at and its story. Growing up, I have to tell you, I didn't hear anything about this. My father's a Mohawk from Six Nations. My mother's a Tuscarora from New York. And it was just a big kind of empty space in our collective memory. I found out a little later that one of my aunts actually went to the Mohawk Institute. And in doing my research that one of the editors, Thomas Peace, was doing, he was looking at the register, the daily register, the record of what was going on there. And sure enough, I found the entry of when my aunt was enrolled at the school. I kept digging, wondering, well, what other relatives did I have there? And I found my great-grandfather, the fellow that I'm named after, Richard Hill. He was a Tuscarora chief. He went to school there back in the 1870s. But there was a big difference from the 1870s to when my aunt went there in the 1920s. So in 2018, I was hired again by the Woodland Cultural Centre to come and do an exhibition. And they gave me 9 months to do it. And if you ever worked on an exhibition, it like takes you 9 months just to get rolling, much less to get this done. But my dad used to say, where there's a hill, there's a way. So I said, yeah, okay, I can do this. So I began to dig around in the history and the archives there and looking at the records. There's tons of federal records. But it didn't take too long when I realized that this is an overwhelming task, that there's so much information, so many layers. I felt I didn't have the confidence to say, this is the story of the Woodland Culture Center. So I asked Thomas, because he was doing this project, who else do we know? And I did a search online. That's how I came across Alice's name, saw the work that she did. And with our other co-editors, Jennifer, she also had a piece that she wrote. So I read their work, and it seemed like a lot of the answers were there. But I don't know, how old was your work by the time I contacted you?
10 years.
Yeah, 10 years ago. I think it was even more for Jennifer. So they all had to kind of dust off the cobwebs from their memory of the Mohawk Institute. Let's see what we can do. So it started as a discussion group, just among a small group of historians. And it kind of grew in number. And as we were talking to each other, what do we know? What else do we need to know? And what should the story of this place include? We were fortunate in one of our meetings to speak with Elizabeth Graham. I don't know if you're familiar with her. She wrote the book on the Mushhold, the two residential schools. And it was really quite enlightening to hear what she had to say, because that book was published, I think, in '89. And she said she was expecting a lot more response to the book, because this was like, oh, you read this stuff, how could you not get all inflamed over it? But it didn't seem to cause a stir. Well, it wasn't until they had the TRC came around, all of a sudden people started looking, and all of that research she did, all of the records she had, all of a sudden became like glowing jewels. We need to know that story. As a result of our stimulating her thinking, she turned around, she donated all her original tapes, her interviews that she did with students, some of them going back to the mid 1900s. So it's quite a treasure trove. We could have published a series of books because there is so much information available there. As we're going through this, we realized too, though, you can't tell it all. But what we wanted to do was to give a broad, comprehensive view of what a residential school is like. This being the oldest and the longest running, and I wouldn't say the least written about, but really the least known in the national picture. So we got many authors from very different points of view, different Indigenous and non-Indigenous authors to begin to unpack this story. As editors, it was quite entertaining because you'll pick up a fact over here and say, oh man, look at that. Go back and forth. Dig up all this evidence. And in this particular case, we're trying to show that there was a crime that took place. And then you have to analyze it. What's real evidence? What's conjectured evidence? And what is just, I don't know, just out of the blue, can't be traced. Unfortunately for the Woodland Cultural Centre and the Mohawk Institute, as we'll explain a little bit, a lot of the records were destroyed in the past, some intentionally and some unintentionally. So we didn't have a continuous line of information to draw from to tell this long story. So we turned to the survivors and talked to them. But the survivors then, much like everybody here that's got silver hair, they went to school there in the 1940s on. So their recollections is only of the last part of the Mohawk Institute. We felt honor bound to dig in. And what's the other story? Who were the other people there? Who taught there? What's the legacy of the place? And so I have to say that this is the first comprehensive view of the story. We rushed and we had to push our publisher, and I give them a lot of credit because tomorrow we're going to be opening the exhibition that I was the curator on to tell this story. So this book coincides with that. It's not the exhibit story, it's but my job was to make sure they were compatible. And so if you ever get a chance to visit the Woodland Cultural Centre and see the exhibitions that we've done, like I say, it started in 2018. So this has been a big part of my life. I have to tell you, it was one of the most challenging exhibits I ever had to do, emotionally, personally. And then it's just exhausting to keep thinking about the same thing so much, and these pictures of these kids and these quotes and these stories. So that's what I focus on in my chapter here, the recollections of the survivors. But it would be like, you talk to your best friend for 2 days, and a guy like Rick Hill comes in and takes 3 sentences out of that conversation and tries to put them into context here. So no matter what you do, it's not the whole story. There's just too many people. We don't know how many went to school there altogether. But I think we still did justice to the survivors and to the people who went there. And we tried to be fair, too, to all of the people who got involved. But it's hard sometimes to be fair when the stories are so tragic, so horrific, and I would say full of deceit, even though if
Cuts out all the time. Cuts out.
register, there'd be a student name, and also at the end of their name is a cross.
Oh,
And you begin to realize after a while, those are students who died, but there's no information about how they died, where they died, or where they were buried. But those crosses start adding up through time. So there's still a lot more to learn, a lot more to explore together. But I think Alison now is going to give you a kind of a broad view of the history behind the Institute and behind our book. And then we're going to have another author talk, and then we'll have some questions and answers. So thank you for coming tonight. I appreciate it very much.
Button's not advancing it. Do you know where that could be?
Yeah.
Okay, wait, let's try this. No. There we go.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Okay, hi, everyone. Thank you. Thank you, Rick, to start us off that way. So I'll talk a little bit more about the project. I'll talk about the history of the Six Nations and the school, and then I'll talk a tiny bit about my chapter before Diana talks about hers. So research and reconciliation is something that I don't think we never used those words when we were working on this book, but I think that's what this book has ended up being. And I think there's, a lot of important principles when it comes to doing research that in a way that it contributes to reconciliation. I think it needs to be community led. And in this sense, I don't think Rick would want to say that he was the boss, but I will say that for myself and Jennifer and Tom, the editors of the book, Rick was definitely sort of
God, it keeps cutting out. Totally
sort of
cut
the
out.
guiding light that led us through the project. We wanted to get the book out sort of as quickly as we could. And I say that acknowledging that we started meeting in 2020 and it's 2025. But the purpose of the book was to gather research that had been done previously, that people had already written or were just completing, get it together and get it in an accessible format. And accessibility, that's kind of one of the third pieces, I think, of research for reconciliation. And that's a critical thing for our book. So we published with the University of Calgary Press, and we did that for a couple of reasons. One is that they make a lovely book, and we're very pleased with how the book looks. And, we are book buyers and book readers, and we like to be able to have a paper book. But also the book is available online for free open access. So everybody can read it online in a really nice, accessible way. You just click on the little plus signs, the chapter's open. It's really nice sort of to read it online that way. And that was really important for us. So as Rick mentioned, our book has a variety of authors. There are interviews and memoirs with survivors. So Rick mentioned his chapter, which is sort of towards the end. We wanted it to be the closing voices. And there are selections of interviews with survivors on various topics. The book also begins with a memoir by Russ Moses, who attended the school in the 1940s. And it's set off by a short introduction by his son, John Moses. And it's fantastic. So I'm really thrilled it's the first part of the book. There's some poetry, there's some art, there's a lot of photographs. We included as many photographs as we could, and especially photographs that we thought hadn't been seen much before. If you are a historian and you teach this topic, there are some photos of schools that you would have seen, that come up quite a bit, that are used on the website of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. But we were trying to include a lot of photos
Why does it keep cutting out?
of the book go to the Woodland Cultural Centre. So that's an important part as well. There's the four of us editors when we met a couple of years ago, a few years ago, maybe at Huron College, when we were kind of going through photos and doing some work. Rick, I think I was wearing the same sweater a few days ago when we were meeting, and I was like, are you wearing the same plaid shirt? But no, it's a different shirt. It's a different shirt. Okay, so you can't read all this and you don't need to read all of this. I have 3 slides that just show all of the chapters within the book. It's divided sort of chronologically and also thematically. It begins with the Russ Moses memoir. And again, we wanted Indigenous voices to both begin the book and close the book. Jennifer Pettit, who wrote her master's thesis, I think in 1990 on this school. Her piece was one of the only pieces you could find if you wanted to know about the history of the school, but you had to go find it on microfiche in a university library, and that's not accessible, right? So that's why Jen was one of the people that Rick brought in, and she, went through her old work and updated it and wrote 2 new chapters that really provide an overview of the school. My chapter is there that looks at teachers and how teachers were trained at the school, and I'll talk more about that later. Evan Habkirk, he talks about the cadets and how there was a cadet program at the school, how children were taught, really received a militaristic education, and how really, I think in many ways, there's a pipeline between the residential school and the military in Canada. Magdalena's chapter at the top is cut off, but she talks about the architecture, really fantastic chapter on the architecture of the house, includes a lot of the plans. I thought I knew a decent amount about the school, but her chapter really is fantastic and explains a lot. There's Diana's chapter there, chapter 8. And I'll continue on here. There's some archaeology, Rick's chapter there, 16, on the survivors, and several poems from survivors and descendants of survivors to close the book. One last thing I'll mention is that Appendix 1, so there was this booklet, and if you visited the Woodland Cultural Centre, over the last 25 years, and went to the gift shop like I did, you might have purchased a short history of Six Nations and their education by Keith Jameson. And this was a booklet that he did and was sold by the museum. And it was one of the only things you could buy or find on the topic. But it's out of print and it's hard to find. It's not online. And so we got the permission of the author and of the Woodland Cultural Centre to reprint it in the book. Because again, we want access to Haudenosaunee voices on their history. We want to make it more accessible. So that's what the book contains. And I should say, Rick got in touch with me in 2018 when he had been hired to do this work. I was working for the Ontario government. Rick asked if he could hire me to do some research on staff at the school. I was working for the government, so it was a bit complicated, but I requested a 30-day leave. That was as long a leave as I could take, a 30-day unpaid leave to come work for Rick. And so I did that, and it was fantastic. I spent a lot of time in the community and in other archives collecting information that would be useful for Rick and the exhibits he was working on. And that has kind of led us into this. We then all started getting together in early 2020. And I think if COVID hadn't happened, we probably would have had a big conference. It would have been different. But given the situation we were in, really our goal for this book, for the group of us editors when we started meeting, was to gather all of the research that existed already, get it together, publish it, and make it accessible, and tell a very clear story about the history of this school. It's a very important school for many reasons, and we wanted to make that history accessible, and I think that this book does do that. Okay, so I've talked a bit about the book. I'm just going to talk a bit about the history of this school. Our title says it's the oldest and longest running school. It only closed in 1970, right, which is not that many years ago. And it's really a model school for the residential school system. It's founded many years before there is a system in Canada. And when this system really begins and grows across Western Canada after Confederation, this school had already been running for several decades and was seen by government and church officials as a model. So here's a map of Canada. It's a little fuzzy. The Mohawk Institute is obviously in Brantford, Ontario. And at the time, it was built on land belonging to the Six Nations of Grand River. And, some of you may know the history of the Six Nations. Very briefly, I'll just say the Six Nations are the Haudenosaunee people. Their traditional territory is in upstate New York. And many of the people fought for the British during the American Revolution. When the Americans, some fought for the Americans, but many fought for the British. When the British lost, they were granted a tract of land in southern Ontario, 6 miles on either side of the Grand River from the mouth to the source. Many people followed Joseph Brant and came into what's now Ontario. And so we have this movement of people into Southern Ontario onto this tract of land. Some of those people, including Joseph Brant, were Anglican. So there is a tradition of Christianity amongst part of the population when they come into Canada. And they build villages along the Grand River. And the Mohawk village, which is now where Brantford is. Let's go to the next slide here. That's an image of the Mohawk village. And on the right there is the Mohawk Chapel. It was the first Protestant church built in what's now Canada, established in 1796. So this is, the area around this becomes the town of Brantford, but this is the Mohawk village for the Six Nations in those early decades. The school is founded initially, there's a small school in 1828, and it's called a Mechanics Institute. And the purpose of it is to train children in sort of skills so they could get jobs and work. The first few years it's for boys, it then becomes a residential school, and then girls are allowed to start attending. Egerton Ryerson, who some of you may have heard of, he had visited the school, and he wrote in his report in 1847 about this school, and his description of the school sort of helps for it to become one of the a model for the further residential school system, which occurs in the 1870s and 80s. So initially it turns, well, after becoming a Mechanics Institute, later on, as the decades progress, it becomes an industrial school. Children attend, and they are really not getting much of an education. The photo on the left there are what are identified as graduates of the school. And on the right is, and that's from the 1880s, and on the right is a photo of boys doing agricultural work. And there's quite a few photos of children at schools that are sort of used for promotional purposes, really. Children are told to pose and smile for the camera. Now, there's many problems, of course, with these schools. Part of it is that they really are not getting much of an education. They have this half-day system where they spend half the day working and half the day in school. And they're obviously really not getting a very good education. After the first structure, they really outgrow the first structure. And I can't remember, is the first one burned down, Rick? Yeah. So the first school burns down, and they build a new structure in 1858. And it's an interesting period. In the early decades, the school really is, it's complicated, but the Mohawk chiefs are sending their children there, is what we know. There is an interest and some support of the school in the early decades. We also know that some of the teachers in the school in the early decades are teaching in Haudenosaunee languages. And again, this is before Confederation, before there is a national system. But we have reports in the New England Company records, which is the missionary society that's running the school. The reports talk about how the teachers, the Haudenosaunee teachers who are teaching in their own languages are actually more effective teachers because, of course, the children can understand them. Obviously, rather than teachers who only speak English. And so I think in the 1850s, 60s, from the records, and of course the records are problematic, it's a different kind of place than it becomes, some decades later. And so this, I think, picture is from a postcard. There aren't very many photographs of this school in this period, but this is one of them. Now, this is the more recent building that if you've been there, you would be walking up to this building, which is quite imposing. The school was burnt down by a fire, and Diana will talk a little bit about this when she talks about her chapter. It was destroyed in 1903, and it was rebuilt in 1904. And everyone, I really think, should visit this place, but you drive down a long driveway with trees on either side. It almost feels like a plantation, like a southern plantation. It's quite imposing as you arrive, and then you have the white columns and the porch sort of right in front of you as you get there. So it's a much bigger building. This is the school that children are at between 1904 and 1970 when it closes. So here's a photo from 1934. And some of our facts there that talk about, the experiences that children had in terms of education, what the focus is on. Certainly there is a shift, and children aren't so much being taught trades, but they are still working on the farm. As Rick mentioned, the school closed in 1970. And at the time, I think there was a conversation. The school, I think, comes under the charge of the three Haudenosaunee nations in Ontario, is my understanding, the Six Nations of Grand River, the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte or Tyendinaga, and the Wata Mohawks. And Rick has talked about how there's sort of a discussion and almost a survey of the community about what to do with the building. In some other places in Ontario and Canada, buildings are torn down. For some, the memory is too negative. And here, it's certainly a negative memory, but I think some of the survivors really want to keep the building and think it's important, really for history, right? For learning purposes. So the building becomes managed by the Woodland Cultural Centre, and that is still the case today. And so this central building is a museum, and there's also a museum sort of off to the left in one of the other buildings that makes up the school. Okay, so that's a very brief sort of overview of the history of the school. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which produced its reports in 2015, but of course had started years before that, certainly talks about the history of this school. And it's clear from some of our research that this school is really seen as a model residential school, and it's looked to by the Department of Indian as like an example of a successful school. And so that's one of the reasons why we think it's really important for Canadians to learn about this school. So the last thing that I'll talk to you just a little bit about, and this is my last slide for me, is about education. So I came to Indigenous history kind of by way of women's history and education history. And when I initially started studying this community of Six Nations, I was looking at the early 20th century and women's lives. What were women doing? Where were they working? What was their role in the community? And what I found between 1900 and 1940 was that there were a lot of teachers. And actually, after World War I, all of the day schools on the reserve were being taught by Nations women. Now, I should say, in this community on the reserve, there were for much of this period 12 day schools, and the majority of children on the reserve actually went to day schools, while the residential school some children went to, and then children from other communities also came to the residential school. When the reserve was consolidated in the 1840s, the school actually is off reserve lands. It's closer to Brantford now. But I think that's an important part of the story, that there was a variety of education options, if you want to say, for children from this community. And part of that is important because we have a principal at the school who begins this education program. And I sort of came to this because I knew that women were teachers in really high numbers. And I started hearing about this teaching certificate that the residential school offered, created by the residential school. And so as I did more research, I sort of came to better understand this. In the 1870s, the principal, I think he actually, Robert Ashton, obviously was very problematic, all sorts of issues with his views and his actions as principal of the school. But he did try to identify children who he thought were capable of higher education and careers in the church or in education. He identified those kids, and initially there's a period where he works to get them grants and funding from the Missionary Society to send them to other colleges, Huron College, Helmuth College, or Helmuth Ladies College. And so he gets these graduates from the school funding, and off they go to do higher education. And then he sort of gets this idea that, wouldn't it be a good idea to train teachers here within, his own building? And so that's what happens. I think children, most of them were girls, but boys as well, take part in this program. And we don't have a ton of details about actually what was happening within the school, but for sure, these teens were working really as teachers, training to be teachers with the children in the residential school. They were living there, but also practice teaching. And so they start issuing these certificates, and the certificate allows them to go and teach on any other day school on a reserve in Canada. And so many of the children do leave and go teach in other schools. So I initially, when I started research at a conference and I sort of told the story about this program, and then Rick, who was watching on Zoom, Rick emailed me with a digital copy of the certificate attached to the email, like, oh, I think I know that certificate. I've seen that before. So I said, fantastic, that's it, exactly what I had been talking about. And this is at the Woodland Cultural Centre in their archives. A few days ago, we were in London last week on Thursday, and we gave a presentation on the book. And two women came up to me afterwards, and I don't know if you can see the name, it's hard to see there, but it's Margaret Miracle from 1882. Miracle is a well-known name in the community. And a woman came up and said, I'm pretty sure that's my great-grandmother, who attended the school, was there in those years, and so we're helping her to learn more because she knows very little about her great-grandmother. So, this is what happens when you publish something, like the stories continue and the research continues to need to be done. Lastly, I'll say the photo on the left there, I know it's hard to see folks' faces in there, but one of the teachers who I've written about in my chapter on what was known as the Indian Normal School or Teachers College is a woman named Sarah Davis. And she had been a graduate of the Mohawk Institute. She was very smart. She took her high school entrance exam and she had the highest grade of anyone in Brant County that year, Indigenous or non-Indigenous kids. She went through this program and became a teacher, and she taught for decades and was really beloved within the community. And also the Department of Indian Affairs really thought she was, a role model and someone that children should look up to, as a woman, a good woman with a good career. In the 1880s, there was a man named William Lant Carpenter, and he was British, and he was traveling around North America. He traveled through 6 nations, took photos, wrote up a report, and went back to England with his photos and published this little booklet about his visit. This photo was in there, and he visited the number 3 school, which is Sarah Davis's school. Now this little booklet, it's not digitized, it's not online, it wasn't accessible, but Bill Akers, who's another professor who wrote some chapters, he had got a copy in London of this little booklet and brought it back. And so when I saw this, I was excited. Now, I don't know who Sarah Davis is in the photo. Maybe here. I don't know. But I do know that she is the teacher for the number 3 school the year that he visits. And I think it's an important picture because we hardly have any photographs from this time period of Indigenous schools and teachers and children. The press kind of said, oh, the quality of this photo is not that good. I don't think we should include it. And I had to really argue and say, I don't care if it's not that good. Look what a beautiful picture it is, and to be able to actually see these children and the school and the teacher in the 1880s, I think is important. So, I've only just briefly mentioned Sarah Davis, but more about her is told in my book, or in my chapter in the book. And so that's what I've written about in this book, is how the school was an Indian normal school really for a period, and it's known as the Indian Normal School. How it produced teachers, and also what impact does that have on the community when you have teachers who go off to the reserve day schools who have been trained at the residential school. Like what does that mean? And I don't really know, but I think it's important to consider. There is a line that the principal says at the time that he sort of suggests that like all of the schools are under his control, even though the principal only controls the residential school, but really he's got children that he trained who have become the teachers in all of the day schools on the reserve. So those sort of impacts that continue out from the residential school at the time. Okay, so I'll turn it over to Diana now to tell you a couple more fascinating stories about the school, and then we'll take questions.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here tonight and be part of this project. It's an honor to share this space with Alison and with Rick, and also with everyone who's contributed to this book. And I'm especially grateful to Alison for inviting me to be a part of it. So my chapter is called 10 Years of Student Resistance at the Mohawk Institute between 1903 and 1913. And I first came across these stories while I was doing research for an Indigenous law course. And I was really struck by the courage and the resilience of these young children who took it upon themselves to make a stand about the conditions at the Mohawk Institute. So I can say that all of the children that I wrote about, they came into contact with the judicial system following their efforts, were unfortunately let down by the very system that was supposed to protect them. So the first story in the book takes us back to April 1903, when three boys, Isaiah Antoine, Jesse Debo, and Roy Wilson, they started the first of three fires that destroyed the Mohawk Institute, as Alison mentioned. These children were only between 12 and 16 years old. Thankfully, no one was hurt, but the damage was so great that the school had to be rebuilt a year later. So I can see that all of these children went through criminal trials, and they were given very harsh sentences. They were given about 5 years at the Mimico Industrial School, which was a reformatory school notorious for its harsh corporal punishment. So what stood out to me while I was doing this research was how little interest there was in understanding these children. Rather, the main goal was punishment and deterring other students from further acts of protest. And so this is just from a clipping regarding the boys that was published in the Globe in 1903. And then going to my second story, it shifts to 1913, and it's regarding two sisters. They're Ruth and Hazel Miller. And these young girls also decided that they couldn't accept things as they were at the Mohawk Institute. And so, along with two of their friends, they planned an escape. They were very determined teenagers, and they sewed clothes out of bed sheets so that they wouldn't be recognized. And they jumped out of a window at midnight, and they walked about 3 hours home. Sadly, the next day, they were returned to school, and the punishment that they faced by the school principal was brutal. So Ruth, who was 13 at the time, she was whipped on her back and about 13 times, and they were also locked in a tiny cell-like room with almost no food or water for days, and their hair was also cut off. So following this punishment, Ruth and Hazel told their father, his name is Chief George Miller, and these girls, supported by their father, they obtained a lawyer and they sued the school for damages due to the severe mistreatment of these girls. So on the day of the trial lasted around 12 hours, and there was testimony from many people, including the school principal and Ruth and Hazel. And one interesting note was that the principal did testify that the children were often served separated milk and spoiled food. And the girls also indicated that that was one of their main reasons for running away. So in the end, the jury did award some damages. The girls were awarded $300 for being whipped and $100 for being locked up in a cell. But the court only recognized part of what they went through and dismissed the rest. So undoubtedly, Ruth and Hazel left their mark in the legal system, especially because only 13 years later, there was an amendment to the Indian Act, which would make it an offense for First Nations people to raise money to hire legal counsel. So I was really inspired by the bravery of these children, that even while living in such difficult circumstances, they found ways to resist. And what I hope readers take away from this chapter is not only the hardships, but also the strength, the resourcefulness, and the resilience of these children. And I want to thank again the editors for being. Thank you.
Oh, one stake. That's one. Thank you so much for being here. Any questions for us? Or comments? Victoria, I feel like you have a comment about to come out of your.
Just how common it was across Canada to burn down residential schools out of student resistance in so many places.
Yeah, yeah.
And yeah, also because I've done a lot of research about Cecilia Jeffrey, the Indian residential school, Kenora, and around the same time, there's also a lot of resistance by both parents and children. So it's interesting. You just sort of wonder what was going on with us at that time, the early 1900s.
Well, and also like the poverty and the pressures, like I think in your chapter, you talk about George Miller had attended the school himself as a child. And I think it's only after his wife passes away that he then sends his own kids to the residential school. They had been going to the day school. So it's these situations that sometimes push parents to send kids. You know, it was mandatory to attend school, residential school or day school. And I mean, I love this story of these children who run away and then like the newspaper articles from the time talk like it was like 10 girls or something. All these young girls give testimony in court in Brantford. Like it's just fantastic sort of, but it's so uncommon that this actually happened and these girls received money and then ended up they stay home and go to the day schools after this. I didn't mention, but in other presentations we've talked about, and I know Rick, we've talked about like who are the children who are attending the residential school, and I said, you know, early on it's you know the a lot of the important families in the community send their kids there, but as time goes on and after Confederation, the Department of Indian Affairs sort of changes their policy for this school, and they identify children who they deem to be vulnerable, orphaned, destitute families. And those kids are then forced to go to the residential school. So it's often really poor families or families who've lost a parent or both parents, you know, who are already, you know, undergoing trauma really. And those are the kids that then are identified and sent to the school. And that's the case, you know, in the late 19th century and then into the 20th. Yeah.
I also, this may be an ongoing issue, the issue of unmarked graves.
Marked graves, yeah.
Did you address that in the book?
Yeah.
And it's such a difficult topic. I just wondered how you did.
Alison, could you repeat the question for the?
Yeah. So question about unmarked graves, and which has become, you know, a topic of increasing interest, I think, for the public and those interested in this history. And Rick, if you want to add anything, you know, let me know. So this school, we do have a chapter that's written by some archaeologists. Sarah Clark is one of them. It's more about items that were found in and around the school that sort of tell us about the, you know, its material culture and that tell us something about the lives of children. There has been work, my understanding is there has been work over the last few years, ground penetrating radar, et cetera. My understanding is that no burials have been uncovered in the grounds. You know, we do know that I think the work of the Secretariat has found that 105 children from this school passed away either at the school or soon after leaving the school. Many of the kids died at home. I mean, a lot of the kids were from Six Nations. The school is very close by to the school, to the community. And so children who were sick often were sent home and passed at home. other, and are buried in cemeteries, in their community. Also, there are some folks who are buried at the Mohawk Chapel. I mean, there was a church and a chapel and a cemetery right close by to the school. So when they started doing research, I would have been surprised if they'd found like a large grave or an unmarked cemetery. Like we know where the cemetery is and where all the cemeteries are at Six Nations, I think. I've done a lot of research on churches and, we know where those all are. So, and they're all maintained. And I don't know if research, that sort of work is still ongoing. I would think it could be. But that's the situation as far as I know at this school. Yeah. Here.
Hi, my name is Pat. I'm the president of the Historical Society. And thank you so much for your hard work. I got one information that I found recently, and I haven't got my phone to even just check on it now. But they are a team of doctors that are checking out this thing here to see, and they found out that many of these students lied. These adults have lied about, they were mistreated and what have you. And it was listed online. And I found that pretty disturbing that, there are people now that are searching, and they have said they have found these adults that have told untrue stories that, they were ill-treated and all that. That was a lie. They've got monies and they shouldn't have. So that's something that we want to just check out and maybe put in a few words.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there's a large movement that now that we would call Indian residential school denialism, where, some folks don't want to that this was an absolutely terrible system that was cultural genocide that really was attacking Indigenous communities and culture. And I think, after the discovery of the graves in Kamloops, the 215, we think probably graves there. I do think that things went, I don't want to say went a little crazy, but I think, people started to look for, I don't want to say the worst case scenarios. I mean, everywhere that there was a school, there are burials. I mean, we know that everywhere where there's a residence of any kind, people died and there are burials. But there have always been people in Canada since these stories have started to come out about abuse. There have been people that have really said, "Oh, this is garbage. This isn't the Canada I know." And there's a pretty big right-wing conservative movement, who doesn't want to listen to the survivors, the thousands and thousands of survivors who attended these schools, and and also the records, the written records in the archives, from government and church sources that really say what happened, So it's an odd time in this history because I think more and more Canadians want to know these stories, and yet there is this small fringe group of people that are, calling survivors liars, right? Which is a horrible thing, right?
So research, both of you. Did any part of your emotion took a hold of you? Did you find yourself tearing up? Want to hear about that?
Yeah, I'll say one thing, and then if you want to answer. When I read about this story of these two girls, sorry, the question is about, did we ever find ourselves, becoming emotionally affected really by the research that we're doing? My two daughters who are here, who walked in a little bit late, right before I started, when they were younger and I was doing this research, I remember reading this story of these two girls, and my memory, and maybe I'm conflating two stories, but is that I think the older girl who's seen as the ringleader, who had sewed clothing so that children weren't identified in their residential school uniforms. I mean, the ingenuity of that, I think the older girl is the ringleader and she's punished more severely. And my memory was the older girl had her hair cut and that the younger girl asked if she could have her hair cut like her sister. And I could be, I don't know if you remember that. That's my memory of this story. And I had little girls at the time. And I just thought, of course, the younger one would want to be the same as the older one, right? So yes, I mean, it's hard because you sort of have to, you're reading, awful stuff all the time, sort of, when you're reading these primary sources and survivor stories. So you do have to somehow protect your heart, but also you have to allow yourself to be affected by this history. And I think I know that's why, I do this work so that I can share it. And so more people can learn this history so we can move, to a better Canada, really, right? And so I think the more people that hear the history and feel it as well, the better. Yeah. Yes, Rick, yeah. Yeah, yeah. Wow.
The Mohawk Institute got identified as a place of conscience. And I had to explore, what does that mean? And so when I first started doing the curatorial work, I used to work for the Smithsonian down in Washington and New York City. So I jumped on an airplane and I went to visit the curator from the Holocaust Museum. I had worked with her on the National Museum of the American Indian. And I asked her the same question. How do you tell a horrific story? How do you do it without driving yourself crazy? And how do you remain honest at what took place there? And then I went over to the African American Museum and met with their curators, talk about the same thing. How do you deal with their harsh history? So I realized that, yeah, sometimes this is very difficult to matter. But with the survivors, they had to submit their case statements in order to get compensated. And two of them actually let me see their statements. And it's kind of, I think that, tell you the truth, that was the toughest part, because here you are, a person my age, having to go in front of this panel of judges. First, you had to go to talk to a psychiatrist, and they're adjudicating whether these events were real, whether they had the kind of severe impact on them. And then they had a kind of chart. If you got penetrated once, you get this money. If it was multiple penetrations, you get this. You get this, you get this. And so it was almost like you're entering the most emotional testimony to be adjudicated in the least emotional response, tallying it up, and then to get your case refused for compensation. Because they had parameters. And one of their parameters, they said, we cannot discuss cultural loss. We can't put an economic value on cultural loss. And yet that was the primary purpose of the Institute. So whatever wounds, and then, as you know, sometimes there's real wounds, consistent trauma. Then there's vicarious trauma by witnessing, and then telling the story or not telling the story. So there was one survivor who was about my age. He revealed his story to his own children just about 10 years ago. He never spoke of it. And when he told his children how brutally he was raped repeatedly, they didn't believe him. They didn't want to believe him. Not my dad. That didn't happen to you. And so we have this kind of internal angst about this, what is real. And I had to be careful, because you don't want to just write a label that accuses some guy of doing things just out of the blue. But when I found 5 survivors independently talking about the conduct of this particular principle, it makes you say there's something going on here. So we did privilege the survivor's voice. Say, tell us what happened to you. Let's present that to you. We give a word of warning both in the text as well as in the exhibition, because some people, and not just Indigenous people, if you were severely abused at a Catholic school, you're going to suffer the same kind of trauma. You're going to, the triggers, these things are going to kick off. So the legacy of history is that seldom does it wash away. Seldom is it the effect of it, both the positive and negative effect of that. And what happened was they start prosecuting some of the Catholic priests out in BC. And they're being convicted. And all of a sudden, the dollar amounts start adding up. So the Catholic Church in particular asked to be indemnified by the federal government. The federal government took over the case. See, we will pay that. And therefore, if you sign one of these agreements to be compensated by the federal government, you also have to hold harmless the perpetrator, even if they're still alive. You can't pursue that. So imagine that dilemma. How much is it worth to get paid in compensation of this versus justice. There was 2 survivors who left the school, and most of the men said, well, this is great training for the military, so they joined, become an American Army, went to Vietnam, fought in the war, survived the war, and then they decided to go back to the Mohawk Institute, marched right into the principal's home, which is right next door to the Institute. They were going to go beat him up, because they're combat veterans. And they get there, and he's sitting in his chair, and of course he's old by then. He's got an oxygen bottle, and the one guy said, I now have the power over you that used to have over me, but I'm not going to treat you the way you treated me. And they turned and walked away. So they came this close. That's what they needed to do. And so we have to raise the question. We don't talk about this too much in the book because this is going to be part 2. Forgiveness and reconciliation. How does it really work? My aunt who went to school there, she was kind of a hard woman growing up. And I reluctantly agreed to go to her. Well, in our communities, we don't always keep track of time. So they said she's around 100. So I said, oh, I better go see her. And I have to tell you, she was the jolliest 100-year-old you'd ever want to meet. She was laughing and smiling and kissing and hugging everybody. And so I was really quite taken back. When she passed away, I taught, and she was a devout Anglican all her life. I went and talked to her priest or a reverend. And I said, I know you can't tell me what she may have shared with you, but did she ever talk to you about her experience at a residential school? He says, oh, yes, we talked about that a lot. I said, I don't understand how this kind of embittered aunt that I had when I was a kid is now this happy-go-lucky lady. He said, well, she got tired of carrying that burden of hate and shame, and she decided to put it down. And the way she put it down, she forgave everybody that hurt her. And then she said, I'm going to make sure every one of my grandchildren's absolutely understands that I love them, I care about them, because I didn't get that when I was in school. So that to me is a very inspiring story about what true reconciliation is like. We can't be victimized by what took place, not only here, but you look at Indigenous history. But we have to learn from those scars that we all carry. Even though I didn't go to school there, my dad didn't go to school there, because of what happened to my aunt, it filters through my family. And we also have to recognize that many of the people in our community loved being a Christian. And that's been their saving grace. For many of the survivors, however, it's the return to tradition that's allowed them to cope with what took place there. Learning their language or speaking the language they couldn't speak there, or doing the ceremonies. And if you meet these survivors, it's amazing. They say, every time I tell my story, I heal a little bit more. So we are trying to honor their memory and their resolve through the work that we do here. So I think if you get a hold of this volume, you'll see that full range from the, how do you want to say it, the cold hard facts that are in a written record versus these kind of records here, the newspaper account. As we're digging around, all of a sudden I find this photograph that has this guy, George Miller's name on it. And then all of a sudden, looking at it, all of a sudden I realized, oh my gosh, there's those 2 girls. He's there with his family. And the 2 little girls that got beaten were dressed in their Mohawk Institute uniform, even though they had other kids. So I went through the same thing. My daughters at the time, I have a girl who's 10 at home, one who's 15, one who's 20. I've been working on this since 2018. You have to think about it that way. What if it was you? What if it was your sister? At one point, there was one survivor said, I arrived there and just a frail little girl, and she was forced to fist fight. One girl was forced to fight her younger sister. So you won't see it tomorrow because they're still working on that part of the building, but they used to have a boxing ring right there. It's like a form of initiation, form of entertainment for the officers. And the beatings were severe, bare-knuckled fighting. But when you grow up with that, And you don't, sit on your mother's lap at your birthday or Christmas time. You don't have a family dinner at Thanksgiving, and you don't have all of that stuff that normalizes and socializes you to peaceful relations. You're going to have a whole lot of angst, a whole lot of behavioral issues. And I don't want to say everybody was damaged, because we have to say, both in the book and in the exhibit, some people did quite well there. And their memories are good. They said, I was never abused. I succeeded. I went on this. That's good. And any institution that you're going to find some of that. But that doesn't discount what happened to those who did get harmed by being at this place. They called it the mush hole because it served such undesirable food, more like a gruel than an oatmeal mush, sometimes 3 times a day. So I'm having my own psychic problems because I love oatmeal. Now somehow I'm feeling like I'm betraying the survivors every time I sit down to my Quaker oats. So anyway, we appreciate your time tonight. Maybe you want to see if we have one more question? Anybody have any?
Some of them never made it home.
Yes, yes.
Passed away.
And there were some stories that I just couldn't verify, of babies being put down in a well in the campus, or a girl getting, and she disappears. So there's still a lot of mystery left in a place like this. Any institution will have these kind of stories. So anyway, the book tries to cover all of the story of the resilience it takes for a child to survive that and to even want to remain Indigenous. To me, that's the amazing victory. The school failed in its mission, but we're still here. Thank you.
Okay, we are going to go over there. We have some books. We can take cash or cards or tap or e-transfer. The proceeds from the books all go to the Woodland Cultural Centre. You don't need to buy it. You can also just read it online. Please take cookies, and everyone needs to take at least 3. And thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate you all. Thank you.
And thank you to everyone who joined us on Zoom. For anyone who'd like to ask a question or submit a comment or share anything, we'd be happy to relay it to the editor team. And again, thank you for joining us tonight.